Sarah Johnson took a deep breath as the morning sun streamed through the kitchen window. At 35, her face showed slight signs of fatigue. In this two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood of New York, Sarah started each day in a rush. "Ethan, breakfast time." Sarah called up to the second floor. The sound of little feet scampering down the stairs was heard, and 3-year-old Ethan appeared. The boy, with his blonde curls and big blue eyes, was the spitting image of Sarah. "Good morning, Mama," Ethan said cheerfully. Sarah picked up her son and kissed him on the cheek. "Good morning, and happy birthday. You're 3 today." In that moment, Sarah felt happy. But her happiness didn't last long. "Sarah, what time is dinner tonight?" Her husband Michael entered the kitchen, adjusting his tie. At 37, he was a career man working at an investment bank. Sarah answered with a slightly tense expression. "Around 7, I think. But Margaret's coming, so we might be a bit late." Michael frowned. "Mom's coming. I didn't hear about this." Sarah sighed. "We talked about it yesterday. It's Ethan's birthday." Michael started to say something but ended up taking a sip of coffee instead. Sarah's relationship with her mother-in-law Margaret had always been a source of stress. In her mid-60s, Margaret was a typical Southern woman with old-fashioned values who didn't approve of Sarah's career ambitions. Sarah worked as an account executive at an advertising agency and struggled to balance work and family life. Margaret viewed Sarah critically as a modern woman who neglects her home. "Mama, is Grandma coming?" Ethan asked. Sarah smiled and answered, "Yes, Grandma's bringing you a present." Ethan was delighted, but anxiety swirled in Sarah's heart. Margaret's visits always brought unpredictable events. After finishing breakfast and sending Ethan off to daycare, Sarah headed to the office. As she drove, she thought about tonight's dinner. Satisfying Margaret while keeping family peace was always a difficult balancing act. Arriving at the office, Sarah immersed herself in work. However, tonight's dinner was always at the back of her mind. At 3 p.m., her cell phone rang. It was the daycare. "Mrs. Johnson, can you come pick up Ethan? It's his birthday today, right?" Sarah hurriedly looked at the clock. She had almost forgotten pickup time, absorbed in her work. "Yes, I'll be right there," she answered, rushing out of the office. After picking up Ethan and finishing some shopping, they returned home just after 5 p.m. As she prepared dinner, Sarah prayed that tonight would go well. At 6:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Sarah took a deep breath and headed to the front door. Opening it, there stood Margaret. In her mid-60s, she wore a neat two-piece outfit with her permed hair neatly styled. "Good evening, Margaret," Sarah greeted with a smile. "Good evening, Sarah," Margaret answered with a slightly stiff expression. "Sorry I'm late. The traffic was terrible." Sarah ushered her mother-in-law into the house. "Don't worry about it. Dinner will be ready soon." As they entered the living room, Ethan came running. "Grandma!" Margaret's expression softened. "Ethan, happy birthday. You're 3 already." She handed over a large package. "Here's your present." Ethan's eyes sparkled as he received the package. Seeing her son's joy, Sarah felt some of her tension ease. "Can I open it?" Ethan asked. Sarah hesitated a bit, but when Margaret said, "Of course," she gave permission. Ethan quickly tore off the wrapping and took out the contents. It was an intricately made wooden train set. "Wow! Amazing!" Ethan shouted with glee. Sarah was impressed too. "What a lovely present, Margaret." "Thank you." Margaret looked a bit proud. "Old-fashioned toys are the best. None of that electronic gadgetry nowadays." Sarah was about to say something when Michael returned from work, so she held her tongue. "I'm home," Michael called from the entrance. "Welcome back, dear," Sarah answered. As Michael entered the living room, Margaret stood up and embraced her son. "Michael, good to see you home." The whole family gathered in the living room, looking at Ethan's new toy. Sarah returned to the kitchen to finish the last of the cooking. Suddenly, an unusual sound was heard from the living room. Then, Michael's panicked voice rang out. "Sarah! Come quick!" Sarah rushed back to the living room. The scene she saw there froze her in place. Ethan had collapsed on the floor. His face was blue, and he was coughing violently. "Ethan!" Sarah cried out, rushing to her son's side. Michael said in a panic, "What happened? What's going on?" Margaret stood stunned, with a bewildered expression. "I don't know. He was just playing with the toy." Sarah tried to lift Ethan, but her son's body was rigid. "An ambulance! Call an ambulance!" she shouted. Michael quickly jumped to the phone. "Hello, it's an emergency. Our 3-year-old son." Sarah desperately spoke to Ethan. "Ethan, hang in there. Mama's here. It's going to be okay." But Ethan's consciousness was fading. His breathing became shallow and irregular. Margaret said in a trembling voice, "Is it my fault? Did I do something?" Sarah had no energy to answer. All her focus was on her son. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens was heard. As the paramedics rushed into the house, they quickly began to assess Ethan's condition. "There's a possibility of anaphylactic shock," one paramedic said. "We need to transport him to the hospital immediately." Sarah, though dazed, gripped Ethan's hand tightly. "I'm coming with you." Michael said, "I'll follow in the car," and told Margaret, "Mom, come with me." Before getting into the ambulance, Sarah's eyes met Margaret's for a moment. Her mother-in-law's eyes were filled with fear and guilt. As the ambulance drove off, Sarah gazed at Ethan with a prayerful feeling. Why did this happen? Why so suddenly? Her head was full of questions and anxiety. On the way to the hospital, Sarah tried desperately to maintain her composure. However, a violent storm of emotions was swirling inside her. Why had today, which was supposed to be a birthday celebration, turned into such a nightmare? As the ambulance sirens blared, Sarah clutched Ethan's tiny hand. She watched intently as the paramedics administered emergency treatment to her son. "We're almost at the hospital," one of the paramedics said. Sarah could only nod. Upon arrival at the hospital, Ethan was immediately rushed to the emergency room. Sarah tried to follow but was stopped by a nurse. "Please wait here. The doctor will examine him." Sarah walked to the waiting room on shaky legs. There, she encountered an unexpected person. Sarah. Turning around, she saw Dr. David Thompson, her childhood friend, standing there. "David!" Sarah exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and relief. "What happened?" David asked with concern. Sarah explained the situation, tears welling up in her eyes. David listened intently with a serious expression and said, "I understand. I'll go check on him right away," before heading to the emergency room. Time seemed to pass excruciatingly slowly for Sarah. Eventually, Michael and Margaret arrived at the hospital. "How is he? How's Ethan?" Michael asked, out of breath. Sarah shook her head. "Still nothing." Just then, David came out of the treatment room. "Sarah, I need to talk to you." The three listened to David with tense expressions. "Ethan is stable now. However, we're not clear on the cause of his symptoms. It's likely an allergic reaction, but we can't identify the specific allergen." "Allergies?" Michael exclaimed in surprise. "I've never heard of Ethan having any allergies." Sarah also looked confused. "I didn't know either." David continued, "We need to run more detailed tests. He'll need to stay in the hospital tonight for observation." Sarah couldn't hide her distress. "Can we see him?" "Ethan?" "Of course," David answered gently. "But please keep it brief." Entering the hospital room, they found Ethan sleeping in a small bed. Seeing him connected to IVs and various machines, Sarah felt her chest tighten. "Mama's here, Ethan." Sarah gently stroked her son's hand. Michael also stood by his son's side, watching him silently. Margaret stood in the corner of the room, wearing an apologetic expression. David entered the room again. "We'll run allergy tests first thing in the morning. Until then, he needs to rest." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, David." As the night wore on, Sarah refused to leave her son's bedside. Michael and Margaret took turns going for breaks. Late at night, David came to check on them again. "Sarah, you should get some rest." Sarah looked up at David with tired eyes. "But Ethan." "It's okay, the nurses are watching him constantly," David said gently. "You need to recover your strength too." Sarah reluctantly agreed and lay down on the sofa provided in the room. However, she found it hard to fall asleep. Listening to her son's breathing, she reflected on the day's events. Why had this happened? And what would happen from now on? Anxiety and fatigue enveloped her. As the morning sun began to shine through the hospital room window, Sarah woke up. For a moment, she was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, but quickly remembered yesterday's events. Ethan was still sleeping. Sarah gently touched her son's forehead to check his temperature. At that moment, Michael entered the room. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and anger. "Sarah, we need to talk," Michael said in a low voice. They stepped out into the hallway. Michael took a deep breath before speaking. "Why didn't we notice Ethan's allergy?" Sarah looked at her husband in surprise. "I didn't know either. There were no signs before this." "Didn't you check Mom's gift?" Michael's voice was full of accusation. "But it was just a toy," Sarah tried to explain. "How could there be allergens in something like that? It's about our child." "We should have been more careful," Michael said firmly. Sarah was at a loss for words. Indeed, perhaps they should have been more cautious. A feeling of guilt gripped her heart. At that moment, Margaret approached. Her eyes were red and swollen as if she had been crying all night. "It's my responsibility," Margaret said in a trembling voice. "I bought that toy." Sarah looked at her mother-in-law. Margaret's guilt was evident, but at the same time, anger was growing inside Sarah. "But Margaret," Sarah said quietly, "you know Ethan well. Shouldn't you have checked if there was anything dangerous?" Margaret's face contorted. "You're the mother. A child's safety is the mother's responsibility." A heavy silence fell between the three. Each was trying to shift blame while not wanting to admit their own fault. Sarah took a deep breath. "What's important now is Ethan. We can deal with blame later." Michael and Margaret looked dissatisfied but agreed. Returning to the room, they found Ethan awake. "Mama," he called out in a weak voice. Seeing her son, tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I'm here, Ethan." Sarah held her son's hand. Michael and Margaret also approached, but kept their distance from each other. The rift that had formed in the family didn't seem easy to mend. As Sarah gazed at her son's face, she felt at a loss for how to overcome this situation. The afternoon after Dr. David gave permission for Ethan to be discharged, as his condition had stabilized, the family left the hospital. A heavy silence filled the car. In the back seat of the car driven by Michael, Sarah held Ethan close. Margaret sat in the front passenger seat, silently staring out the window. "When we get home, let's make sure he gets plenty of rest," Sarah said quietly. Michael just nodded. His expression still showed a mix of anger and anxiety. As they arrived home and Sarah carried Ethan towards the front door, she stopped in her tracks as soon as she opened it. A strange man was standing in the living room. "Hello, Johnson family," the man said, showing his ID. "I'm Detective Brown. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Sarah was too shocked to speak. Michael stepped forward and asked, "What's this about?" Detective Brown carefully chose his words as he began to explain. We received a report from the hospital. We need to investigate the cause of your child's injury. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. You don't mean, you suspect abuse? The detective continued without changing his expression. We need to confirm the situation, including that possibility. Michael, barely containing his anger, said, "That's ridiculous. We cherish our child." Sarah, though shaken, sat on the sofa still holding Ethan. Margaret stood silently in a corner of the room. Detective Brown began asking questions politely but in detail. About Ethan's daily life, family relationships, and the events of the incident day. Sarah and Michael desperately tried to explain, but sometimes stumbled over their words due to confusion and fatigue. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Margaret said softly, heading towards the door. Surprisingly, it was Dr. David standing there. "Hello," David said as he entered the room. "I came to check how things were going." Detective Brown frowned. "And you are?" David introduced himself and explained that he was Ethan's attending physician. He seemed to understand the situation when he noticed the detective's presence. "Detective," David said with a serious expression. Ethan's symptoms were clearly due to an allergic reaction. There are absolutely no signs of abuse. Detective Brown listened to David with interest. David explained in detail about Ethan's symptoms and their cause from a medical perspective. And, David continued, the test results show that Ethan has a rare wood allergy. It was probably triggered by the wooden toy he received as a birthday present. Sarah and Michael looked surprised. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, unable to hide her shock. After thinking for a moment, Detective Brown slowly stood up. "I see. It seems the suspicion of abuse has been cleared. Thank you for your cooperation." After the detective left, a sense of relief filled the room. However, at the same time, new questions had arisen. A few days after the police incident, Sarah's family was once again gathered in Dr. David's office. This time, Margaret was also present. David began speaking with a serious expression. "Actually, there's something that concerns me about Margaret's recent behavior." Sarah and Michael exchanged anxious glances. Margaret sat uneasily in her chair. "There are signs of early-stage dementia," David said quietly. A heavy silence fell over the room. Margaret said tearfully, "Is that so? I've been so forgetful lately." Sarah took her mother-in-law's hand. "Margaret," David continued, "it's likely that forgetting about Ethan's allergy was also due to these symptoms." Michael let out a deep sigh. "So that's why the wooden toy." Margaret apologized through her tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to put Ethan in danger." Sarah embraced her mother-in-law. "We understand. I'm sorry for blaming you." Michael also approached and placed a hand on his mother's shoulder. "I'm sorry we didn't notice, Mom." David, watching the family, said quietly, "It's fortunate that we caught this early. With proper treatment and support, we can slow the progression of symptoms." Sarah said with determination, "We'll support Margaret as a family." Michael nodded. "That's right. Mom, let's get through this together." Margaret repeated words of gratitude while wiping away her tears. That night, the family had dinner together for the first time in a while. As they sat around the table, they discussed their future life. "Margaret, how about living with us?" Sarah suggested. Margaret answered with surprise, "But I'd be a burden." Michael said, "It's okay, Mom. We're family." Ethan chimed in with an energetic voice, "Grandma, let's live together." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. "Thank you, everyone." As Sarah looked around at her family, she thought about how this ordeal had made them a stronger, more understanding family. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Sarah was certain that with mutual care and understanding, they could overcome any difficulty. On a Saturday morning, 1 month after that tumultuous day, Sarah was making pancakes in the kitchen. From the living room, she could hear Ethan and Margaret laughing. "Grandma, which color should we use next?" Ethan's cheerful voice rang out. "Let's see, how about blue?" Margaret answered gently. Sarah smiled as she transferred pancakes from the griddle to a plate. Since Margaret had moved in, the house had been filled with a warm atmosphere. Michael, while making coffee, came close to Sarah. "Mom seems to be doing well lately." Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's thanks to everyone working together to care for her." To slow the progression of Margaret's dementia, the family had created a schedule, incorporating medication management and cognitive training into their daily routine. Ethan, too, while enjoying time with his grandmother, naturally played a supporting role. "Breakfast is ready," Sarah called out, and Ethan came running. "Yay, pancakes!" Ethan's eyes sparkled. Seeing her son growing healthily without allergy concerns filled Sarah's chest with relief. Gentle smiles adorned the faces of the family gathered around the dining table. Having overcome difficulties and deepened their understanding of each other, their bond was now stronger than ever. As Sarah looked around at her family, she thought to herself, "This is our new normal. There are challenges, but we can overcome them together. Yes, this family would surely be all right." Sarah